Good morning, veterans, families, honored guests, and all who share an interest in the history of our nation. Welcome to all who have gathered here in Hawaii or around the world virtually to experience the Legacy of Peace Aerial Parade. It gives me great pleasure to share a welcoming message from Linda Hope of the Bob Hope Legacy, representing the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation. Their generous support of the World War II 75th Commemoration ensures that the legacy of all veterans continues to inspire and motivate our children, those who are destined to lead our future. We're here to commemorate the end of World War II, and it's fitting to do so on the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Instrument of Surrender that took place on the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. As you hear these words or read them on our website, it's humbling to note that World War II veterans are here with us. They traveled to Hawaii to be present as we honor the day peace returned to our world, a day that unleashed dancing in the streets as families and loved ones rejoiced at the return of our fighting forces. To highlight the spirit and determination of our World War II veterans, vintage World War II aircraft have made the long journey to Hawaii on the USS Essex to fly over the USS Missouri as they did in 1945, signaling peace and the commitment to global friendship that followed. The aircraft symbolize courage, fortitude, can-do spirit, and the grit of our World War II veterans who endured horrific hardship and loss in their fight to preserve freedom for all mankind. Please go outside now and turn your eyes skyward and follow the route these historic aircraft take as they make their way to Pearl Harbor. Flying in groups based on type and speed, most of them traveling at speeds approaching 190 miles per hour, they will fly over the USS Missouri, tipping their wing in tribute. Watch closely, because as they pass, whether you're watching them from the shores of Pearl Harbor or at any point along their route, most of the aircraft will be visible for just 20 to 25 seconds. Men and women who have come to be known as the greatest generation flew all of the aircraft that you will see today. 3/4 of a century ago, they left their peacetime lives to fight oppression and to defend our freedom in every corner of the globe. We are grateful for their bravery, sacrifice, and service. And we are here today to celebrate G.I. Joe and Rosie the Riveter. In a speech he made in December of 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt recognized that the great Legacy of Peace Aerial Parade would play a pivotal role in our country's anticipated involvement in the war that was already raging across much of the world. President Roosevelt understood the raw power of the United States and its people when its will and resources were focused on a single common goal would be unstoppable and immediately recognizable. He knew that once this country became involved in hostilities, the immense U.S. industrial complex would transition from the peacetime manufacture of automobiles, tractors, bicycles, and airliners to the wartime production of jeeps, tanks, machine guns, and warplanes. And he was right. For the second time in less than 1/4 of a century, the American people were called on to help save the world from the forces of tyranny and oppression. And in the battlefields of Europe, the islands and waters of the South Pacific, and in the factories throughout this great nation of ours, they responded to that challenge as Americans always have. In the intervening years, the stories of those brave Americans and what they did has been told, but told so less frequently. In the history books and in the classrooms of our schools, the narrative of World War II has been reduced to a few paragraphs or a day or two of instruction. Those stories which fundamentally changed the world for the better deserve more. Americans should know that not so very long ago, our way of life, our freedom, and the fate of much of the world hung in the balance. And the resolve with which this country rose to that challenge is, even 75 years later, awe-inspiring. Over the last several months, as we've prepared for this commemoration and the historic flyover that will begin in just a few minutes, we identified several themes common to all who helped earn the Allied victory in World War II. First, everyone participated, if not in uniform, then working in the factories, building machines, and producing munitions and supplies that our boys put to such effective use on dozens of different battlefields around the world. Second, there is a genuine, heartfelt humility among those men and women who willingly walked into harm's way to protect and defend this country. Finally, and most poignantly, the deep respect that the veterans here with us today have for those who they consider to be the real heroes of World War II, those men who did not come home. Those warriors gave their last full measure of devotion to the epic struggles that took place 7 decades ago in faraway places like Midway, Burma, Bataan, Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, Tinian, and Tarawa. Today, it is our challenge and our great honor to use a remarkable collection of vintage military aircraft to tell their stories. We'll start this Legacy of Peace aerial parade with the airplanes that were used to teach our boys to fly, the trainers. In 1938, when General Hap Arnold, commander of America's Air Forces, considered this country's preparedness for war, he recognized that America did not have nearly enough airplanes or pilots to fly them. 3 years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, what would later become the U.S. Army Air Forces consisted of 21,000 airmen and 1,800 aircraft. By the end of the war, the Army Air Forces included 2.3 million people, and production of aircraft of all types reached nearly 300,000. In a war that military leaders quickly discovered would be determined by air superiority, this unprecedented, almost inconceivable increase in American air power was widely recognized to be one of the most important factors in the Allies' success. But 3 years before Pearl Harbor, the arsenal of democracy had not yet been activated, and the United States was looking at an immense disparity between what it had and what it would soon need. So, drawing on the expertise of prominent aviation leaders, the military created what would become the Civilian Pilot Training Program. By the time this program ended, it had trained 435,000 pilots, including future astronaut and Senator John Glenn, Triple Ace Bud Anderson, and Tuskegee Airman Robert Dietz. All military pilots completed a training program that was accomplished in 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. This process was designed to gradually increase the complexity of the pilot's training. Primary introduced the pilot to the principles of flight. Basic introduced them to the complexities of radio communication and flying in formation. And advanced training was designed to prepare the air crews to go into combat. One of the iconic trainers was the Boeing Stearman biplane, an open cockpit aircraft constructed of wood, fabric, and tubular steel. There were more than 24 different variants of the Stearman designed, and more than 10,000 were built. Another primary trainer was the Fairchild PT-19, a monoplane that was used by the U.S. Army Air Forces, the British Royal Air Force, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Like the Stearman, the PT-19 was an open cockpit design. Advanced training was accomplished in an aircraft like the North American Texan, weighing in at nearly 3 tons with a 600 horsepower radial engine and retractable landing gear. The Texan was designed to prepare pilots to fly the state-of-the-art aircraft that would be used in combat. By the end of the war, North American had built more than 15,000 Texans, including the AT-6 variant for the Army Air Forces and the SNJ version for the U.S. Navy. The AT-11, known as the Twin Beach, in civilian life also served many functions, including as a training platform for bombing, navigation, and gunnery. On the other side of the Atlantic, the British used the venerable de Havilland Tiger Moth biplane as their primary trainer. This iconic aircraft played a key role in preparing virtually every British and Commonwealth military pilot over a two-decade period beginning in 1932. In total, nearly 9,000 were built, and many are still flown by civilian pilots in the UK and throughout the rest of the world. In the early days of World War II, the Army and Navy did not yet have sufficient resources to patrol and protect shipping routes in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico at a time when German submarines were prowling the waters off the eastern shores of the country and sinking vitally important tankers. The military senior leadership at that time asked for help from the newly formed Civil Air Patrol, an organization of civilian pilots volunteering to use their aircraft in defense of the nation. Armed with small bombs and depth charges, the CAP's Coastal Patrol used light single-engine aircraft like the Stinson L-5 Sentinel, the Aranca L-16 Champion, and the Piper L-4 Grasshopper to fly missions from 21 bases from Maine all the way to Texas over an 18-month period. The Civil Air Patrol spotted 173 possible submarines, attacked 57, and dropped 82 bombs. It also flew over 24 million miles during 5,684 convoy support missions. Its efforts helped the military push the submarine threat well away from coastal shipping lanes, but not without a cost. The Coastal Patrol suffered 26 fatalities and 90 aircraft lost during the early years of the war. In addition to Coastal Patrol, CAP pilots performed many other critical tasks, including search and rescue, target towing, border patrol, forest fire patrol, interceptor training, and dozens of other missions. When Pearl Harbor was attacked by carrier-based aircraft of the Japanese Navy, the only modern U.S. Army Air Forces fighter stationed in Hawaii was the Curtiss P-40, an all-metal, 300-mile-per-hour 1937 design. The P-40 was rapidly overtaken by far more capable fighters, but at 8 o'clock in the morning on December 7th, 1941, that airplane was our country's first line of defense against 350 Japanese fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers. By 9 a.m. that day, more than 2,400 Americans had been killed. Much of the Navy fleet had been ruined, and more than half of the Army Air Force's aircraft on Oahu were damaged beyond use. The lone aerial opposition came from individual pilots like Lieutenant George S. Welch, Lieutenant Kenneth A. Taylor, and Lieutenant Philip N. Rasmussen, who raced for any airplane they could find. Flying P-40s, much like those you see here, pilots shot down a number of Japanese aircraft on that day of infamy. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 100 recruits, led by Claire Chennault, one of the most gifted and controversial commanders of the war, began flying P-40s to protect China from Japan. In 7 months before the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, was disbanded and incorporated into the 23rd Fighter Group of the Army Air Forces, they savaged bombers from Japan and immortalized the fierce shark's teeth paint scheme on the nose of their P-40s. In April of 1942, after a series of stinging setbacks in the Pacific, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers off the USS Hornet on a bombing raid to Tokyo and 4 other cities. The raid resulted in only minor damage to its targets, but it had profound impact on Japanese strategy, causing military leaders to be more concerned about attacks on Japan than they otherwise would be. But the B-25's contribution to the war effort was not limited to the Doolittle raid. The aircraft had an important role in every battle theater of World War II. In the Pacific, it provided close air support, strafed Japanese tanks and airfields, and destroyed bridges. In Europe, the Mitchell operated as a medium bomber, and the Navy and Marine Corps used the PBJ-1 variant to find and destroy enemy ships. During the war, B-25s were also flown by the British, Canadians, Dutch, Australians, Soviets, Brazilians, and the Chinese. In early June of 1942, the Japanese and American navies converged on a tiny volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the stage was set for a dramatic shift in momentum in the Pacific theater. Tipped off to Japanese plans by U.S. cryptographers who had broken Japanese radio codes, PBY Catalina flying boats were deployed from Midway Island to search hundreds of miles of ocean for enemy ships. One of them found the Japanese fleet steaming toward Midway. The crew radioed the information back to military leadership. The large, lumbering, two-engine seaplane had provided the U.S. with an early advantage in the coming battle. From 3 U.S. carriers, F-4F Wildcats flew escort for slower Devastator and Dauntless bombers, but logistical problems and bad luck plagued the Americans as they began their attack. Most of the American torpedo bombers were shot out of the sky. In the first 3 hours of the battle, not a single U.S. bomb or torpedo hit a Japanese ship, despite 8 separate attacks by a total of 94 American aircraft. Then the tide turned. As the Japanese focused their attention on the torpedo bombers flying just off the surface of the water, SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked from higher altitude, fatally damaging 3 of 4 Japanese carriers, and an hour later, a second attack by dive bombers led to the destruction of the 4th Japanese carrier. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. When the U.S. Marines stormed the shores of Guadalcanal in August of 1942, Japanese conquest had reached their peak. This bold, unexpected offensive would prove to be a critical turning point in the war in the Pacific. A small but strategic airfield on the island was the focal point of 6 months of fierce battle on the ground, in the air, and on the sea. By the time the Japanese conceded the island in February of 1943, nearly 25,000 Japanese and 1,600 Americans had been killed, with thousands more dead from malaria and other tropical diseases. Central to the battle was the venerable Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which was operated from carriers by U.S. Navy pilots and from Henderson Field by Marine Corps pilots throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the sturdy and resilient Wildcat was the principal and most advanced fighter for both the Navy and the Marines in the Pacific. Later in 1942, Bell P-39 Airacobras, assigned to the U.S. Army Air Forces, joined the Wildcats of the Marine Corps, operating from Henderson Field. The Airacobra had success in other theaters as well, and were part of the vital so-called Cactus Air Force defending Guadalcanal. Like the Wildcat, the P-39 was outmatched by the faster, more agile Mitsubishi Zero, flown by Japanese carrier-based fighter pilots. Both the Wildcats and Airacobras were able to get their own hold against those Zeros because of their rugged construction, the unique battle tactics developed by aviators, and the skill of the men who flew them. And now, Yamamoto's final flight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet and mastermind of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. In the spring of 1943, American cryptographers intercepted and decoded a message with Yamamoto's itinerary for a trip between two islands in the Solomon Island chain in the South Pacific. On April 18th, a flight of 18 Lockheed P-38 Lightning aircraft were dispatched from Cookham Field on Guadalcanal on a long, low-altitude, circuitous route designed to evade enemy radar, maximize the element of surprise, and attack. The twin-engine, twin-tailed P-38 was uniquely suited to the challenges of this mission. No other fighter deployed in the Pacific had the long-range capability to fly 600 miles over open ocean, intercept enemy aircraft at a certain point and at a certain time, engage them in battle, and then make the return trip of 400 miles. Over the skies of the Pacific, the American P-38s intercepted two Japanese bombers carrying Admiral Yamamoto and his staff, escorted by 6 fighters. They destroyed both of the bombers, killing Yamamoto. The mission, nicknamed Operation Vengeance, not only avenged the deaths of 2,400 Americans at Pearl Harbor, it also deprived the Japanese of one of their finest military strategists. Mustangs to the rescue. In the early days of the war, after the Allies had decided that the British would conduct nighttime bombing raids on German targets and the Americans would bomb during daylight hours, mission losses that occurred beyond the range of fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt were horrific. Without fighter escorts, the U.S. bombers suffered unsustainable losses to German fighters. Some estimates put the fatality rate of B-17 and B-24 crews at nearly 50%. That began to change with the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range fighter when outfitted with external fuel tanks made of a kind of papier-mâché, a non-strategic material. The Mustang could fly more than 2,000 miles equipped this way. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, excellent maneuverability, and the aggressive tactics flown by fearless and highly trained pilots made the P-51 an impressive dogfighter. Some of the young men who flew the Mustang were pilots from the 332nd Fighter Group, the first African-American fighter unit. They provided escort to missions over Italy during 1944 and 45, commanded by West Point graduate Colonel Benjamin Davis. The Red Tails, a nickname based on the identification paint on their airplanes, shot down 111 German aircraft. By D-Day, the combined bomber offensive from England and Italy had broken the German Air Force. The P-51 also served in the Pacific Theater as a long-range fighter, flying from forward air bases and using the same techniques as in Europe. The P-51 was instrumental in long-range bombing missions. George H.W. Bush. In early September of 1944, 4 Grumman TBM Avengers operating off the light carrier USS San Jacinto attacked Japanese military installations close to the island of Chichijima, approximately 500 miles south of mainland Japan. Piloting one of those 4 Navy aircraft was future U.S. President George H.W. Bush, who was tasked with destroying a particular radio tower. Although the mission was successful and the target was destroyed, all 4 aircraft were subject to intense anti-aircraft fire. During the attack, Bush's aircraft was hit and his engine caught fire. He flew several miles from the island and ordered his crew of 2 to put on their parachutes and to prepare to bail out. Of the 9 airmen who escaped their planes that day, Bush was the only one to survive. After floating in his inflatable raft for 4 hours, he was rescued by the USS Finback, a rescue submarine. By the end of 1944, Bush had flown 58 combat missions and received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Avenger was a torpedo bomber manufactured by both Grumman and General Motors. Nearly 10,000 were manufactured and served in the U.S. Navy, the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Immortalized forever by the photo of Marines raising the U.S. flag over Mount Suribachi, the Battle of Iwo Jima helped to secure 3 airfields and provided the United States with an important staging area for the much-anticipated invasion of the Japanese homeland, as well as an emergency landing field for Japan-bound bombers and a home base for fighter escorts. It is a testament to the ferocity of the fighting on Iwo Jima that more than 25,000 U.S. Marines were killed or wounded during 35 days of fighting in February and March of 1945, and nearly 19,000 Japanese soldiers were killed as well. It was the only battle of the war in which U.S. casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. Carrier-based chance-fought F-4U Corsair fighters were critical to American success during the battle for Iwo Jima. As originally designed, the pilot sat far back in the fuselage of the Corsair, and his view was restricted because of the 2,000 horsepower engine, 13-foot diameter propeller, and huge fuel tank, making landings extremely challenging on the pitching deck of a carrier. So early models went to land-based Marine pilots who put the aircraft's speed and heavy armament to effective use in both dogfights and in ground support. Eventually, Corsair pilots shot down 11 Japanese aircraft for every Corsair lost. By the beginning of 1945, Marine Corps pilots were flying low-level missions with bombs, rockets, and napalm in support of their fellow Marines on the beaches and in the jungles of small islands throughout the South Pacific, including Iwo Jima. The Japanese nickname for the Corsair was Whistling Death. The Boeing B-29 Super Fortress carried a bomb load of 10,000 pounds on its 2,000-mile round trip to Japan. At an altitude of 30,000 feet, it was able to fly above most of Japan's home island defenses. Instead of conventional gun turrets, the B-29's defensive weapons were linked through a remote control system that was a marvel in the 1940s. By the time B-29s entered the war, an earlier generation of heavy bombers had leveled much of Germany. So the super fortresses were deployed to China and later in the Mariana Islands. The move to the islands put the aircraft within 1,500 miles of Tokyo, well within the bombers' range. With their large numbers and vast payloads, it wasn't long before the B-29s had destroyed nearly every strategic target in Japan. The only aircraft then capable of delivering the world's first nuclear bombs, modified super fortresses, joined their comrades in the summer of 1945. On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar targeted Nagasaki with a plutonium bomb. On August 14th, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. The surrender was formalized in a ceremony on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. Over 12 million Americans answered the nation's call over the course of the Second World War. During the 45 months that the U.S. was involved, more than 400,000 servicemen would pay the ultimate price for freedom, meeting death on the ground and in the skies over war-torn continents or in the seas between them. The cost of ultimate victory must never be forgotten. The Missing Man formation serves to remind us of those who sacrificed their future for that of our nation. And it's a tradition which dates back to World War II. The symbolic moment when a single aircraft breaks formation and soars skyward, leaving behind his comrades in arms. Could you please rise and help us recognize our fallen heroes while Taps is being played? Ladies and gentlemen, 75 years ago today, the world rejoiced. Throughout America and in Honolulu were scenes of immense impromptu street parties. Huge celebrations were held in Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and especially New York's Times Square. Every contributor to the Legacy of Peace aerial parade had done their part, from the servicemen fighting for their country overseas to the factory workers and businesses providing those servicemen and servicewomen with the weapons of war that were so vital to their success, to the families who went without so that the boys overseas could have all that they needed. Securing peace was a collaborative effort, a triumph that the entire country could be proud of. And 3/4 of a century later, we are no less proud. For all of those here today who played a role in America's success in World War II, whether in a military or civilian capacity, thank you. Thank you for your service. For all others, thanks for joining us here today to help commemorate our country's peace achievement in World War II and recognize the men and women who made it possible. Many thanks once again to the government agencies that helped make today's aerial parade possible, to the nonprofit organizations that helped to plan and conduct this historic event, to the pilots participating in the flyover, and especially to our sponsors, including our presenting sponsor, the Bob Hope Legacy, as part of the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation, with additional support from Federal Express, Southwest Airlines, SSA, Raytheon Technologies Corporation, and others. My name is Dave Price, and it has been a great honor and pleasure to spend time with you here today to commemorate the Allied achievement 75 years ago. Travel safely. When you have the opportunity, be sure and thank a veteran.